Tonight, we step into the glow of a silent revolution, a world where firelight became a workshop, where a branch held over the embers became strategy, and where a simple weapon began to reshape how our ancestors moved, hunted, fought, and imagined the future. This is the story of the fire-hardened spear, the first time humanity looked at a material and thought, I can make you different. So, what if I told you the first engineered weapon in human history was not stone, but wood touched by fire, long before metal, long before arrows, long before anything thrown through the air? There was a single idea whispered in the dark. Heat can change what the world is made of. Archaeologists have found spear tips that were not carved but transformed, their fibres tightened by flame, their edges hardened until even large game felt the difference. This was not an accident. It was the first moment humans experimented on purpose with the structure of matter itself. Now imagine this, a time when a spear was nothing more than a branch shaped by patience, abrasion, and instinct. No heat, no chemistry, no experiment waiting in the embers of a small fire. Just wood carved against stone, sharpened through friction, and trusted because there was nothing else to trust. In those early stretches of the Pleistocene, long before heat would ever touch a weapon, a wooden spear carried a meaning that was almost biological. It was an extension of the hunter's arm, not yet an extension of the human mind. And yet, even in this simplicity, the first traces of what would become engineering were already gathering quietly at the edges of survival. We don't know for certain what the earlier spearmakers thought as they shaped these tools, but the evidence from Schöningen in northern Germany gives us one of the clearest windows into this early technological moment. Found in waterlogged sediments dating back roughly 300,000 years, the Schöningen spears offer something rare in archaeology. Wood preserved well enough to reveal intention through geometry. Their shafts were shaved into aerodynamic forms, their tips subtly thickened for durability, and their balance consistent across multiple examples. Nothing in these objects feels accidental, and yet they show no signs of heat treatment. Their sharpness came from abrasion alone, their hardness limited by the natural properties of spruce and pine. The revelation here is not what humans did with fire, but what they achieved before fire ever entered the conversation. These were tools made through knowledge that came from touch, not transformation. Microscopic use wear on these spear tips suggests they were used primarily for thrusting at extremely close range. The tips show compression, and lateral stress marks consistent with powerful forward force delivered at a distance no farther than the length of a human arm. A thrusting weapon is not a weapon of confidence. It demands proximity, timing, and cooperation. And even with several individuals working together, it leaves little margin for error. If a strike failed to land cleanly, or if the animal shifted direction, the hunter was suddenly standing within reach of hooves, horns, or tusks. These spears reveal a world where danger was not something that arrived from afar. It stood directly in front of you. The environment reconstructed from the Schöningen site deepens this understanding. Seasonal lakes bordered by marshes, reed beds, and narrow strips of fir-covered upland created natural choke points, where herds could be funneled, surrounded, and cornered. Hunting in such places required cooperation on a scale that few other species attempt. Kill layers show horses driven into tight clusters, their final movements written in overlapping footprints and scattered remains. In such narrow spaces, a thrusting spear becomes less a tool of dominance and more a fragile negotiation between predator and prey. Archaeologists infer that coordinated group hunting played a central role here, with individuals positioning themselves strategically to control escape routes. A spear in this world was both weapon and anchor, a tool that held a hunter to a moment of confrontation that could not be escaped once initiated. The untreated wood of these early spears also places limits on what could be attempted. When modern researchers replicate these tools using the same species of spruce, they find them remarkably effective, up to a point. Wood without heat treatment can be sharpened to a keen edge, but it lacks ductile strength. Under force, the fibres compress, shear, or split. A point may land only once before needing to be reshaped. This imposed a predictable rhythm: attack, withdraw, repair, repeat. Hunting with a natural spear was therefore not only a physical act, but also a temporal one, shaped by repeated cycles of preparation and renewal. The materials themselves dictated the pace of survival, and yet within these constraints early humans achieved something extraordinary. They built a hunting strategy around cooperation, not force. They understood animal movement across marshy terrain. They recognized the importance of ambush in narrow corridors. They developed a tool that could be used repeatedly despite its limitations. These spears reflect a mind not yet experimenting with the properties of matter, but already deeply attuned to the structure of the landscape and the behavior of the animals within it. The spear did not change nature, it responded to it, adapting to the challenges of waterlogged ground, shifting wind, and the unpredictable movement of large herbivores. As we examine the spear in its earliest form, what stands out most is its lack of transformation. No heat darkened its fibres, no chemical alteration strengthened its point. It was sharpened through friction, guided by the memory of prior hunts, and carried with a mixture of caution and reliance. This was a tool that worked only because the hunter understood its limitations intimately. It demanded courage, coordination, and constant repair. It did not solve problems, it merely postponed them. The spear at this stage remained in the realm of instinct, not innovation. And so, the earliest weapon was not yet a product of engineering. It was a product of necessity. A length of wood hardened only by its natural grain, shaped by the repetition of hands that learned through repeated encounters with danger. In this moment of technological infancy, the spear tells us something fundamental. Before humans changed their tools, they learned to understand themselves. They learn the rhythm of fear, cooperation, timing, and the delicate threshold between risk and reward. The natural spear required a hunter to be fully present, entirely embodied, and perpetually aware of the thin line separating life from injury. Only later, when someone held such a spear over a fire and watched its point change colour, did a new idea emerge. An idea that wood might not be limited to what the forest gave. Someone, somewhere, must have tilted a tip toward flame and noticed that the fibres shrank, stiffened and tightened. That a point, once soft, now resisted pressure more firmly. That the world, in small ways, could be persuaded to behave differently. This moment would set humanity on a path toward modifying matter itself. But before that shift occurred, this spear lived in its raw state, reflecting not intention, but adaptation. The earlier spears were extensions of the hand, not yet extensions of intention. And then someone wondered whether wood itself could be persuaded to change. Imagine a moment when a human stood close enough to a flame to feel its heat bending the air, yet far enough that curiosity could grow without fear. There is no language for that moment, no engraved memory, only the faint suggestion of a turning point preserved in the way wood behaves when fire brushes against it. We do not know the name or the face of the first person who hesitated before withdrawing a half-shaped spear from the edge of a hearth. We cannot reconstruct how many accidental scorchings preceded intention. but the evidence suggests that long before metal, long before the shaping of stone flakes into formal projectiles, fire revealed a quieter secret, that its touch could change the very structure of the material it met. And one day, someone noticed. This revelation does not come from myth or speculation. It comes from the microscopic examinations of charred wooden points, where the cellular architecture of hardwoods records transformation, the way a manuscript records handwriting. Under magnification, researchers have identified shrinkage patterns that do not match the signatures of uncontrolled burning. Instead, they reflect exposure to moderate, sustained heat, the kind achieved when a tool is carefully rotated near embers rather than thrust into open flame. The cell walls collapse in predictable directions, moisture escapes gradually, and the outer layers tighten. These are not the scars of accident. They are the fingerprints of human choice. They tell us that at some time deep in the Pleistocene, a person learned that fire was not only a force of destruction, but a means of modification. This recognition marks one of the earliest moments when heat itself became a tool. Experimental archaeology has helped us understand how this knowledge might have emerged. One controlled study replicated the hardening of spear tips by placing fresh-cut branches at specific distances from embers and turning them slowly by hand, allowing the wood to dry and stiffen without igniting. The results were striking. The hardened tips showed increased resistance to splintering when thrust into dense material. The experiments revealed that even minor shifts in technique produce measurable differences in strength. A few centimeters closer to the fire and the tip becomes brittle. A few centimeters farther and the wood remains too soft. The correct zone requires attention, patience, and an intuitive understanding of heat gradients. Such controlled outcomes strongly suggest that ancient people practiced, refined, and transmitted the necessary techniques. It is unlikely that a process this sensitive arose through accident alone. Distinguishing intentional shaping from incidental burning remains a central challenge, yet the line becomes clearer with accumulated evidence. Tools burned by natural wildfires or accidental hearth contact exhibit irregular patterns of charring, often deep and uneven, with cracking indicative of sudden temperature shifts. In contrast, the artifacts examined in laboratory conditions show uniform carbonization, limited to the outermost millimeters, and a consistent directionality in wood fiber distortion. These traits match deliberate rotational heating rather than chaotic exposure. The contrast is subtle, but repeated across sites it forms a pattern of behavior rather than coincidence. It suggests that early hominins did not merely stumble upon fire-hardened points, but recognized, however gradually, that the properties of wood could be persuaded to change. Ethnographic parallels from societies that continued to use wooden spears into recent centuries illuminate how such knowledge may have been shared. Some communities describe the hardening process in terms of listening to the wood or watching for shifts in colour and sheen. Others speak of learning through imitation, a young hunter watching an elder adjust the angle, turning the shaft with quiet precision. These accounts are not direct windows into Pleistocene cognition, yet they demonstrate that the skill can be passed down through close observation rather than abstract instruction. They show how thermal modification becomes embedded in tradition, joined to experience rather than theory. The parallels do not prove ancient behaviour, but they clarify that the technique does not require complex language or conceptual frameworks. It requires only curiosity, repetition, and the memory of what worked. Mechanical testing of experimentally hardened spears reveals further detail. In controlled trials, heat-treated points exhibited significantly higher durability under axial load. They resisted deformation and breakage in ways untreated wood did not. This difference is small in absolute terms, but large in behavioural implication. A slightly stronger spear tip means fewer replacements, fewer failures during the tense moment of a hunt, and a greater likelihood that effort invested into stalking or ambush pays off. These marginal gains accumulate into meaningful change. They alter expectations and reduce risk. And wherever risk declines, planning grows. From this evidence emerges a realization that occupies a quiet but transformative place in human history. Fire ceased to be mere warmth or danger. It became a collaborator. This shift did not require a conceptual revolution or a leap toward metallurgy. It required the simple insight that heat can be persuaded to shape material, that its power is negotiable rather than absolute. Once this relationship formed, even informally, it allowed humans to reinterpret the world around them. Plants, soils, fibres, and bones all possess structures that respond predictably to temperature. The first hardened spear point was not just an improvement in hunting efficiency. It was the earliest known moment when humans looked at an elemental force and saw not only its threat, but its potential. And this collaboration began to shape the rhythms of daily life. Working near fire required spatial awareness, patience, and fine control. It encouraged individuals to differentiate between fuel types, to notice how embers behave differently from open flame, to understand the stages of heat and cooling. Over time, these observations wove themselves into a growing body of practical knowledge. The hearth became both a centre of warmth and a centre of instruction. Mobility patterns shifted as people sought woods best suited for thermal modification or maintained controlled fire environments. Even the act of sitting near a hearth changed as toolmakers adjusted their positions to achieve consistent results. All of this unfolded long before written memory, yet the archaeological traces capture enough detail to reconstruct the broad outlines of this early technological awakening. We do not know how long it took for the idea to spread, or how widely it was adopted. Some groups may have used fire solely for warmth, while others experimented more boldly with its possibilities. The archaeological record is uneven, and waterlogged preservation is rare. Yet across regions and periods, the convergence of evidence supports a shared trajectory. Fire evolved from an environmental factor to an instrument of craftsmanship. This evolution occurred not through sudden insight, but through slow accumulation, a gathering of small observations repeated until they formed skill. In recognizing this, we glimpse the foundation of something much larger. Thermal modification is not only a technological innovation, it marks the beginning of a deeper relationship between humans and transformation. To heat wood deliberately is to imagine an outcome before it exists, to trust that material properties can be shaped by intention. It is an early form of engineering, not yet formalized but unmistakably experimental, and it is also one of the first times that humans engaged with a natural force as a partner rather than a threat. Everything from pottery to metallurgy to cooking rests on this same principle, that heat reveals possibilities hidden within matter. This partnership with fire shaped not only tools but minds. To work with heat is to anticipate change, to refine technique through trial and error, to notice patterns and remember them. These cognitive demands encouraged foresight, planning, and collaboration. The ability to prepare a spear that would be needed days later required imagining the future in practical terms. And this growing capacity for projection, once learned, could be applied to countless other activities. The moment heat became a tool, it also became a teacher. And with collaboration, planning emerged. All right, hello fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to step into the glow of the first engineered weapon our species ever shaped, the fire-hardened spear. Tonight, we move slowly through deep time, through the moment when heat became strategy and a simple branch held over embers changed the future of every hunt that followed. This is sleepless homo, soft science, quiet archaeology, and long-form storytelling for minds that wander late at night. We're just humble researchers digging through deep time with you, calmly, patiently, one discovery at a time. A night when the forest no longer meant only darkness. Picture a group of early humans kneeling beside a hearth so small it barely interrupts the vast quiet of the Pleistocene canopy, and yet its light begins to alter everything. They lift raw branches toward the flame and watch the surface change, not simply because heat hardens wood, but because fire reveals textures otherwise invisible. In that narrow halo of light, where shadows stretch and fold with every movement of the fuel, a wooden shaft becomes something more than a branch. What if I told you that our ancestors did not merely harden spears during these moments, but also learned to sense their environment differently, as if the forest itself had begun speaking with new cues? Archaeological reconstructions of nightwork around small hearths suggest that crafting by fire was as much a sensory apprenticeship as it was a technological one, teaching people to look, listen, and breathe differently inside the dark. We do not know for certain how many generations passed before these quiet gatherings became routine, but the evidence suggests that once humans began shaping wood with flame, the night landscape gained a new vocabulary. One of the earliest clues comes from the simple observation that green wood bends and behaves differently under firelight than seasoned wood. Experiments in controlled illumination show that moisture content changes the way light refracts across a surface. Green wood scatters firelight through microscopic water pockets, giving the shaft a duller, softer gleam. Seasoned wood, stripped of moisture and dense from age, reflects light with a sharper, more metallic shimmer. This contrast would have been immediately visible to the people tending the fire, allowing them to judge the readiness of a branch by sight alone. And in a world lit only by flames, such distinctions meant the difference between a weapon that would splinter and one that could strike with force. Even before the spear hardened, the human eye was learning to read subtle differences the forest never revealed in daylight. As the evening deepened, the forest responded in other ways that would have shaped perception. Nighttime acoustics differ from daytime acoustics, especially in dense woodlands. Cooler air settles near the ground, carrying sound farther and more clearly, while tree trunks become resonant chambers that amplify soft noises. Under these conditions, every scrape of wood against stone, every hiss of sap against flame, every shift of a log inside the fire would have sounded larger and closer than it actually was. Ethnographic parallels from communities who still work by firelight show that nighttime crafting sharpens auditory awareness, encouraging people to pause more often and interpret faint disturbances among the trees. This heightened listening was not superstition, it was ecological knowledge. The forest at night has its own grammar, and early humans had to learn it in order to survive. While they hardened wood for the next day's hunt, they also practiced a kind of acoustic vigilance that would later inform both tracking and tool-making. Smell, too, became a form of information. Modern chemical analyses of charred hardwoods reveal predictable stages of scent release as a branch is rotated near flame. First comes the grassy sweetness of evaporating moisture, then the sharper, resinous notes as linen begins to break apart. Finally, a deep, smoky odour as carbonized layers form on the tip. Early humans would have encountered these olfactory cues long before they understood their chemistry, yet the smells themselves would have reliably signalled when a point was ready to be withdrawn from the heat. Ethnographic accounts from societies that still harden wooden tools confirm that smell often guides timing more accurately than sight does. When the scent shifts to a darker, earthier tone, the wood has reached a stage where the outer fibres stiffen but the inner core remains tough. On these prehistoric nights, human noses were learning the thresholds of transformation. Fire was no longer an unpredictable force, but a process that unfolded in recognisable stages. Archaeological studies of hearth distribution patterns offer another window into nighttime behaviour. Small, deliberate fires associated with tool-making occur at distances that imply social clustering rather than large communal gatherings. Instead of one large blaze, there are often 2 or 3 compact hearths, spaced just far enough apart to allow quiet conversation without interrupting concentration. This layout suggests that working by firelight encouraged a kind of intimate cooperation. People needed space to shape their tools without collision, yet they did not drift far from one another. The circle of light stitched them together while preserving an individual rhythm of work. In some cases, the spacing of hearths corresponds closely with the heat radius, optimal for wood hardening, hinting that social structure and material process became intertwined. To craft by night is to accept limits set by light, and so each group had to arrange itself around those limits with care. Nighttime visibility itself became a constraint that early humans had to negotiate. Experimental reconstructions indicate that firelight fades sharply beyond 3 or 4 meters and distorts depth perception just outside its brightest zone. This limited field of clarity meant that work had to be done slowly, with deliberate positioning of the spear relative to the flame. Crafting could not be rushed, because rushing would risk uneven hardening or accidental scorching. Thus the night imposed a rhythm on the work. Rotate the wood, pause to inspect, lean closer, adjust the angle, step back to regain perspective. In daylight, such attention might have felt unnecessary, but under darkness it became essential. Anthropologists studying traditional nightcraft note that people unconsciously reduce their movements, aligning their bodies with the fire's glow to minimize shadow interference. This behavioral adjustment would have shaped early work sessions around the hearth, producing a distinctive posture and pace specific to nighttime woodworking. From all these sensory shifts, a larger transformation emerged. A glowing spear tip held in the dark was more than a tool in progress. It was a sign that humans had begun to manipulate material properties with foresight rather than impulse. The forest that watched them work was no longer simply a place to find branches. It had become a workshop whose raw materials could be altered, improved, and understood in new ways. Firelight opened small pockets of visibility in a world otherwise ruled by shadow, and in those pockets humans learned to anticipate change rather than merely react to it. They learned to sense the behaviour of matter under heat, to wait for the moment when wood crossed an invisible threshold from pliable to sturdy. Such learning required attention, patience, and trust in a process that unfolded slowly, often without clear markers. And so the night itself became a partner in invention. The archaeological record cannot show us the exact expressions on those early faces, but the remains of controlled hearths, the distribution of charred wood fragments, and the microscopic changes within hardened points reveal that these nocturnal gatherings were not random. They were purposeful sessions in which people borrowed the landscape's darkness and fire's brightness to develop new sensory relationships with the material world. The forest, once feared at night, became a place where transformation could be observed rather than only endured. It is possible that these evenings also reshaped social bonds, as individuals who mastered the timing of fire hardening gained authority within the group. But whether such hierarchy existed or not, the act itself became a new ritual of attention. Heat, wood, smoke, and shadow converged into a single lesson. Matter is not fixed. In that dim circle of firelight, a future of engineered tools quietly took shape, not yet stone-tipped, not yet composite, not yet thrown with leverage or stored energy. The spear that emerged from the flame was still simple, yet the night that produced it was no longer simple at all. It taught early humans to see what they had never noticed, to hear what they once ignored, to smell what they once dismissed as smoke. Sensory learning became technological learning, and technological learning became a new way of inhabiting the world. A glowing tip in the darkness signalled a new intimacy between humans and possibility, and what began around the fire soon appeared in the soil. If you enjoy these slow journeys into the past, a gentle like and subscribe helps other sleepless thinkers find this space. And tell me, how do you listen? Before sleep? While working? Headphones in the dark? I always love knowing where these stories keep you company. And if you drift off, don't worry. The timestamps will guide you back to wherever you left the trail. All right, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Walking across a landscape where everything that once mattered has rotted away. No wood, no fibres, no shaped branches survive the long patience of soil and weather. Yet under your feet lie layers of compacted earth, each a quiet witness to something done with purpose. Picture a moment when archaeologists kneel before such a surface, brushing back sediment so fine it floats like smoke, searching not for objects but for effects, discoloration, charcoal flecks, miniature fractures inside blackened soil. The question that guides their hands is simple and impossible. How do we detect a technology that leaves almost nothing behind? What if I told you that the oldest evidence of fire-hardened spears is not a spear at all, but the ground remembering what touched it? We do not know for certain how deliberate those early experiments were, but the sediments suggest intention rather than accident. At several Pleistocene sites, micromorphology studies reveal hearths that were not used for cooking, warmth, or waste disposal. Instead, they show thin layers of ash laid down repeatedly at low temperatures, each phase consistent with careful maintenance of a flame meant to alter material rather than consume it. This is where the revelation emerges. The soil's internal structure shows patterns of repeated heating and cooling that match the signatures created when wooden spear points are hardened experimentally with controlled fire. These hearths were workshops rather than campfires, and though the wood itself vanished, its transformation left a readable imprint. The information grows from such subtle clues. In some horizons, researchers found charcoal particle distributions forming slight crescents, implying that tools were held in a consistent orientation around the ember glow. The burned wood fragments recovered are not from fuelwood species typically gathered for warmth, but from hardwoods better suited to spears. Every tiny piece is examined under magnification, revealing cellular shrinkage that indicates the wood reached just the right temperature for hardening, far below the point of ignition. In several sites, the sediments contain cracked splinters, whose thermal patterns differ from accidental burning. They show the fine radial fractures characteristic of green wood, brought close to fire and then quickly cooled. Associated stone tools, particularly bone scrapers, suggest concurrent preparation of shafts before the hardening process. And radiometric dates push this behaviour surprisingly far back into periods where the archaeological record once assumed only rudimentary tool use. The soil is telling us that controlled fire treatment predates many of the innovations traditionally labelled as engineering. As these fragments of evidence accumulate, a realization emerges in the same quiet way a hearth fades to embers. Even when the wood vanished, the behaviour that shaped it endured in the ground. The transformation of the spear left no intact artefact to admire, but it left patterns in sediment, clues in the microstructure of ash layers, and a logic in the association of tools and debris. It reminds us that early technology was often invisible, composed of gestures rather than objects. To find it requires paying attention to the shadows of actions, the places where hands and fire once cooperated, the faint halos of heat that left their mark only by changing what they touched. These are not grand discoveries, but the patient recognition of repetition, intentionality and pattern, qualities that distinguish behaviour from accident. And as archaeologists reconstruct these faint traces, another insight begins to take shape. Technology does not always enter the record with a dramatic artefact. Sometimes it arrives as a barely perceptible shift in how humans relate to their surroundings. The fire-hardened spear was primitive by later standards, yet it signalled a new relationship with matter, a willingness to shape nature not with force, but with gradual persuasion. It required waiting. It required observation of how wood responded to heat. It required keeping a flame small and steady rather than simply feeding it. In that patience lies the earliest whisper of engineering. What remains in the soil is therefore not only evidence of warming wood, but evidence of a mind willing to collaborate with time. The transition comes gently, like the end of a long-held breath. If the ground remembers the spear remembers the hunter, shaped by fire, strengthened by intention, and carried into a world that was beginning to change him in return. And the transformed spear changed the hunter who carried it. What becomes striking, once the soil begins to speak in these subdued ways, is how much early technology depended on the choreography of space. In several sites, the patterning of ash and burned fragments does not radiate randomly across a living floor. Instead, it forms deliberate arcs that slightly curve away from the hearth, suggesting that workers stood at consistent intervals. These arcs are not mere footprints preserved by accident. They represent a repeated geometry of activity. The distance between human and flame had to be just right, not only to avoid scorching the wood, but also to achieve the desired internal change. This choreography hints at an emergent understanding of boundaries, of where to place the body in relation to a process that could not be rushed. It is another clue that the act of hardening wood was already becoming a patterned craft, something practiced rather than improvised. In a few layers, analysts have traced faint halos of reddened soil extending beyond the main hearth basin. Such halos form only when heat permeates the surrounding earth slowly, over sustained periods. Their size suggests that the fire was kept small yet enduring, watched for hours rather than moments. It implies that whoever worked there understood fire not as a burst of energy, but as a tool requiring attentive stewardship. The technical implication is simple. Heat must be controlled for wood to transform gradually. The human implication is far larger. This transformation required waiting, and waiting required intention. Even the refuse speaks in ways that reframe our assumptions. The concentration of bone scraper fragments, found consistently on the periphery of these hearths, suggests that preparation of spear shafts often continued alongside the hardening process. It means that early humans worked in cycles, alternating between shaping wood with sharp edges and withdrawing it to the fire. Some scraps bear microscopic polish, a sign that they once shaved moisture-rich wood before it met the flame. The pairing of these residues suggests a technological sequence, not a single act. Technology at this stage was not a moment but a rhythm. More intriguing still are the absences. In several occupation layers, hearths associated with wood hardening appear in areas separate from domestic fires. This spatial segregation hints at rudimentary zoning, where certain activities belonged away from sleeping or cooking grounds. It is not yet the specialization of later villages, but it is a subtle shift toward organizing space around tasks. The earth retains these decisions long after the tools themselves have vanished. Taken together, these scattered signs form a portrait of the first workshops. Open air, flickering, improvised, yet unmistakably intentional. They show humans creating conditions in which transformation could occur, conditions invisible unless one knows how to look for them. It is a reminder that the earliest engineering was not defined by tools but by the behaviours that shaped them, and the transformed spear changed the hunter who carried it. Walking behind a line of hunters on a cold morning when the grass still holds the night's breath, picture the moment before anything moves, before the herd senses danger, before the first footfall breaks the rhythm of the plain. In this stillness, every choice matters. How close to approach? From which angle the wind will betray a presence? Whether the ground underfoot will hold or collapse? For most of human prehistory, these decisions were dictated by limitation rather than strategy. A wooden spear, sharpened only by friction, demanded proximity. The hunter's world was therefore compressed, defined by the small circle of space in which both hunter and prey could wound one another. But what if I told you that once fire entered the spear, distance itself began to open? We do not know the exact moment when hardened tips changed human behaviour, but the evidence suggests a quiet shift rather than a sudden revolution. Experimental studies comparing penetration depth between untreated and heat-hardened wood reveal a dramatic difference in both durability and impact force. A hardened spear could pierce deeper, fracture differently, and maintain its shape after multiple uses. This meant a hunter could choose where to stand rather than be forced into the narrow margin between success and injury. Archaeological analyses of kill site topography indicate that early humans began to occupy higher ground, tree peripheries, or sloping embankments, exploiting gravity and angle rather than sheer closeness. These vantage points appear too distant for unmodified wooden points to have been effective. Something stronger must have been carried in those hands. Information accumulates in these landscapes. Studies of coordinated drive techniques, where groups of hunters push herds toward constricted zones, reveal an efficiency that matches the use of improved spears. The stronger tips allowed hunters to stand slightly farther back when delivering the final thrust, freeing some members to block escape routes or flank the herd rather than engage directly. Ethological modelling of herbivore tolerance thresholds supports this interpretation. Certain species will hold their ground at distances where untreated spears would fail, but retreat or panic when sharper, deeper penetrating weapons threaten them from farther away. This interplay of prey behaviour and spear capability begins to rewrite how we understand early hunting. It was not only about courage or strength, but about calculating opportunity from beyond the immediate reach of danger. Bone trauma patterns in early hominin remains extend this perspective even further. Compared to older populations, later groups show fewer injuries associated with close-quarter combat with large animals. Healed fractures consistent with trampling or goring become slightly less common in contexts where hardened spears appear. While not definitive, this reduction hints that improved weapon durability allowed hunters to survive encounters that would once have cost them bone or breath. In this subtle way, technology reshaped risk. No longer did the hunter's fate hinge solely on coordination or luck. The spear itself carried a portion of the burden. As these patterns become clearer, a realization emerges with the same careful, steadying felt. When a spear is first braced against the palm, the sharpened, hardened point created a small but profound freedom. It let the hunter choose distance, angle, timing, and approach. It allowed hunts to unfold with more options than constraints. Instead of reacting to the movement of prey, hunters could anticipate it, shaping the encounter with intention. The spear no longer followed the contours of the hunt. It began to dictate them. Fire had given wood the ability to change not only its own structure, but the structure of decisions that surrounded it. And so the story of strategy does not begin with maps or plans, but with a point of wood strengthened by fire, teaching early humans that distance itself could be moulded. But strategy emerged not only in movement, also in thought. Yet the change did not stop with the simple act of stepping farther back. As hardened spears became normal tools rather than rare improvements, hunters began to experiment with the geometry of opportunity itself. We can see faint traces of this in how kill sites were chosen. Slopes were no longer simply obstacles or vantage points. They became part of the weapon's design. A hardened spear gained momentum more reliably from an elevated thrust, and so hunters began positioning themselves along inclines where even a modest downward angle increased impact strength. The terrain became a collaborator, and each rise or embankment offered a slightly different calculus of distance, weight, and risk. Archaeologists studying the spatial distribution of faunal remains notice patterns that cannot be explained solely by availability of prey. Some sites reveal animals brought down in clusters along narrow passages, where escape paths naturally constricted. Others reveal animals struck at the edges of marshy ground, where the softer substrate slowed them just enough to make a second or third thrust possible. Hardened spears, capable of maintaining their point through multiple impacts, made such deliberate positioning worthwhile. The landscape around a hunt was no longer just background. It was a set of possibilities, each one tested, remembered, and carried into the next season. With stronger tools came a more distributed sense of responsibility within hunting groups. Those at the front no longer bore the full danger alone. Individuals with hardened spears could rotate positions, some choosing to stay slightly behind the line and strike when the chaos of movement created an opening. Others learned to anticipate the paths animals took when startled by an initial blow, waiting at angles shaped not by instinct alone but by accumulated knowledge of how wounded prey tend to turn. This shift, subtle and slow, reshaped the social pattern of the hunt. Skill did not vanish, but it diversified. Strength mattered, but anticipation mattered more. There is also the quiet but unmistakable suggestion that hardened spears influenced how early humans interpreted the behavior of prey. A tool capable of delivering a deeper wound encouraged hunters to read signs of fatigue, breath, and gait in ways previously unnecessary. The pacing of a chase, the rhythm of exertion, the small hesitations in a herd's collective movement all became clues that mattered because the weapon could capitalize on them. This was not merely a physical extension of the arm, but an extension of attention, drawing the hunter into a more analytical relationship with the world around them. In this way, the spear imposed a new structure on the hunt, not only by adding strength to the moment of impact, but by adding foresight to the moments before it. A hardened point made every choice upstream more consequential: where to stand, when to wait, how to read the shifting lines of the herd. The spear did not simply stiffen the wood in a hunter's hands, it stiffened intention, and with each deliberate step back from danger, the mind stepped forward into strategy. Imagine a moment when a human lifts a branch not because something is chasing them, and not because hunger presses against the ribs, but because they are thinking about a hunt that has not yet happened. Picture the quiet pause at the edge of a forest where the raw material of the future rests in the hand, a length of straight wood still smelling of sap, not yet shaped, not yet hardened. In this small gesture lies something more than preparation. It is intention, moving forward in time. The spear that will emerge from this branch does not exist yet, except inside the mind that selects it. We do not know the first individual who made this shift, but the evidence suggests that the fire-hardened spear required a form of predictive reasoning notably different from the opportunistic tools that came before. Ethnographic reconstruction of sequential manufacturing steps shows that the process is longer than it appears. One must select the correct species of wood, usually one with dense early wood and a straight grain. One must remove bark and shape a point before the fire ever touches it. One must wait for the green wood to settle or season, then rotate it gradually over embers so that the heat reaches only the outer fibres, shrinking and stiffening them without forcing cracks deep into the shaft. Everything about this process requires imagining not just what the spear will look like, but how it will behave later, when the hunt is neither immediate nor guaranteed. This is where the cognitive archaeology of delayed return toolmaking becomes significant. Tools like simple flakes or unmodified branches are immediate return technologies, items made and used in the same moment. Fire hardening breaks that pattern. It requires deferring the tool's usefulness, investing time in a future action that may not occur for days or weeks. Neural imaging studies among modern practitioners indicate that such delayed return crafting engages networks associated with visualization, working memory, and prospective planning. In simpler terms, the brain begins handling events that have not yet happened, rehearsing them before they unfold. The spear becomes an idea long before it becomes a point. Archaeological data adds another layer. At some sites, clusters of wood selection remains indicate that specific trees were harvested repeatedly, implying knowledge of which species offered the best hardness after charring. This is foresight encoded into material behaviour. Logs showing repeated cutting of hazel or juniper demonstrate choices not about the present, but about how the wood would respond to future heat. These are not decisions made in the chaos of a hunt. They are decisions made in the calm of anticipation. The distinction between opportunistic and intentional preparation becomes clearer when comparing sites with and without evidence of manufacturing zones. Areas where spear tips were hardened show patterns inconsistent with spontaneous tool creation. Hearths used for cooking tend to have fluctuating temperatures and messy distributions of charcoal. Hearths used for hardening are smaller, steadier, often appearing in sequences, as though a single individual or group returned to them repeatedly for the same purpose. The soil chemistry reflects this. Lower peaks of burned fat, higher peaks of fine charcoal and altered wood fibres. These are the fingerprints of routine intention, not chance. What this reveals is that the act of shaping the spear was itself a quiet rehearsal of the hunt. To craft the tool was to step mentally into the future, to imagine the animal that would eventually feel its point, the ground where the encounter might unfold, the strength required for the thrust. The toolmaker's thought stretched forward, linking the present moment at the fire to an anticipated moment elsewhere on the landscape. For the first time, perhaps, humans were not simply responding to their environment, but projecting themselves into it, sculpting potential outcomes through preparation. This cognitive shift would have had subtle effects on daily life. A group that spent evenings crafting hardened spears was engaged in a shared vision of tomorrow, not only that a hunt would occur, but how it might unfold. The crafting circle became a space where knowledge of wood, heat, and animal behaviour accumulated. Younger members watched older hands rotate the shaft, learning to read the colour of the tip as it passed from pale to hardened brown. The spear had not yet tasted the world, but already it carried the collective intentions of those who shaped it. The significance of this is simple, but profound. When humans began preparing weapons in advance, they stepped into a new relationship with time. The future became something one could participate in, influence, and plan toward. The spear was made in the present, but it existed for the sake of a moment somewhere ahead. Technology, in this sense, is not just the extension of muscle or reach, it is the extension of thought. And when intention entered the craft, landscapes themselves began to shift. Paths were chosen because of future hunts, camps arranged around potential tool-making sites, and forests read not only for what they offered now, but for what they would become after fire touched wood. And ideas reshaped landscapes in unexpected ways. Imagine a time when a single change in the way a piece of wood was prepared could alter the shape of a journey. Picture a hunter standing at the edge of a dense forest, where shadows overlap and the light fractures into narrow paths. For most of human time, such places were margins rather than destinations. Dense vegetation restricted movement, damp wood softened spear tips, and the risk of wounding an animal without killing it increased with every step into the undergrowth. But now imagine that same hunter holding a spear whose point has been hardened by fire, its fibres constricted, its surface strengthened, its reliability no longer at the mercy of moisture or chance. In that quiet difference lies a widening horizon, and it prompts a question that sounds almost too large for its humble beginnings. How far can a single improvement push a species across new terrain? We don't know the first valleys or forests where hardened spears tipped the balance, but paleoecological maps allow us to trace shifting zones of human movement with surprising clarity. In regions where untreated wood would have failed, evidence of cut-marked animal bone appears in layers corresponding with cooler, wetter climates. For early humans, these were not comfortable environments. Damp ground, warped shafts, rot softened tools, and dense vegetation forced closer engagements with prey. Yet as fire hardening spread, these same difficulties became less restrictive. Expanded exploitation territories appear in the archaeological record not as sudden expansions, but as slow, tentative extensions outward, like the branching of a root system probing new soil. Hardened wood did not simply strengthen the spear, it strengthened the reasons to step into places once avoided. Faunal remains tell their own version of this story. In sites associated with fire-modified wooden points, prey species become more diverse. Not only the animals of open plains, but the creatures that shelter in thicker forests or colder uplands begin to appear. This includes species whose hides, bones, or fat would have provided crucial resources for surviving harsher winters. The technological improvement allowed hunters to pursue animals whose defences or habitats previously demanded tools that did not yet exist. In this sense, the hardened spear did not merely expand geography, it expanded diet, risk tolerance, and ultimately population stability. Where prey diversity rises, vulnerability to seasonal scarcity falls. Settlement patterns shift as well, revealing a quiet but persistent movement toward wood-rich environments. This may seem obvious. Wood is needed to make spears, but the proximity of settlements to suitable material suggests something more deliberate. Humans began choosing landscapes that supported not just food, but tool-making. The forest became a partner, offering shafts, fuel for controlled hardening, and the ecological niches where new kinds of prey lived. Such choices imply planning beyond immediate necessity. The environment was no longer only a backdrop for survival, it was a reservoir of potential future hunts. Geographic information system models comparing hunting success in various vegetation densities reveal another layer of transformation. In open areas, untreated spears could work, though unreliably, since thrusting required an unbroken line of motion. In thicker vegetation, however, thrusting became more dangerous. Reduced visibility, uneven footing, and higher chance of animal counterattack made close contact a greater risk. Hardened fire-treated tips reduced these risks not by eliminating the need for proximity, but by increasing the odds of swift, effective penetration. A reliable point meant fewer repeated thrusts, fewer moments for prey to react, and fewer injuries sustained by hunters. GIS-based reconstructions show that, with hardened wood, the probability of a successful kill in forested environments rose enough to make those habitats worthwhile, even without advanced projectile technology. In practical terms, the forest became huntable. Mobility patterns begin to reflect this change. Seasonal movement routes widen, reaching deeper into territories that were formerly marginal. Winter camps appear at elevations slightly higher than before. The remains of hearths used for heat treatment occur in places that would not have supported year-round habitation, but served strategic purposes for short, intense periods of hunting. All of this suggests that the strengthened spear allowed humans to use landscapes in a new rhythmic pattern, to move not only toward resources but through them. It is worth pausing to consider the scale of such a change. A hardened wooden point is not a dramatic innovation when held in the hand. It looks almost like its untreated ancestor, only slightly darker at the tip. Yet in the record of human movement, it functions like a hinge. It opens new biomes, widens migration corridors, and reduces the cost of exploring the unfamiliar. The improvement does not announce itself with spark or flash. It reveals itself through footprints, bones, and hearths scattered in places where earlier tools would have failed. What emerges from this scattering is the realization that technology's influence on human expansion is often less about invention than about reliability. When a tool becomes more dependable, the world becomes more negotiable. Hardened wood allowed humans to walk into dense forests knowing their weapons would not splinter, and into colder regions knowing they had a means to secure the fat and hides needed for survival. It turned once avoided landscapes into sustenance. It made new paths worth walking, and as humans adapted to these expanded terrains, prey, too, began to adjust. Picture a moment when an animal lifts its head, long before the hunter steps into view, because something in the world has changed in a way it cannot name. The air carries the faint scent of charred wood. The forest floor holds disturbances that were not there the season before, and the rustle of human bodies moves with a confidence that has not always existed. Imagine that instant, the quiet calculation inside an animal that has learned, slowly and painfully, that the shape approaching through the understory now carries a point that behaves differently. A point that does not bend as easily, that strikes deeper, that ends the chase sooner than instinct had prepared it for. We often picture humans adapting to their prey, but the evidence suggests prey adapted right back. We do not know for certain when this shift became visible across landscapes, because animals do not leave us their memories. Instead, we find their learning written indirectly, in the paths their hooves pressed into ancient mud, in the breakage of their bones, and in the unexpected caution patterns preserved in sediments. The revelation emerges from trackways found in places where herds once travelled in habitual lines, carving predictable trails down to watering holes or along ridges. At certain sites, those lines suddenly diverge. Herds begin to split earlier, veering away from narrow passages where ambushes were likely. Some paths widen, as if individuals sought to avoid clustering near points of danger. These behavioural signature appear not as random noise, but as coordinated responses, patterns consistent with increased pressure from close-range hunting. Archaeologists studying these trackways often compare them to modern ethology, how living animals respond when new predators or new methods of attack enter their worlds. What emerges is a picture of prey species beginning to treat humans with a sharper edge of fear, not just fear of the human form, but fear of the tool that form now carried. Alongside these paths, the bones of animals showed deeper punctures than untreated wood could typically achieve. Microscopic examination reveals longer wound channels and cleaner entry points, consistent with hardened spear tips that retain their shape under stress. These traumas are not diffuse or superficial. They speak of weapons that maintained rigidity through hide, muscle, and bone. Seasonal behaviours also begin to shift. Herd animals that once lingered in particular grasslands during dry months start clustering more tightly during periods of greatest human movement. Some appear to migrate earlier in the year, abandoning patches they had relied upon for generations. These patterns can be inferred from scatter distributions of remains, from isotopic signatures showing altered foraging zones, and from the sudden absence of young individuals in regions where they had been common. It is as if entire populations recalibrated their risk assessments, learning that certain valleys or lake shores had become too dangerous when fire-hardened spears gave hunters greater lethality at close range. Comparative ethology helps fill in what fossil evidence alone cannot. When predators develop new hunting strategies in modern ecosystems, prey rapidly incorporate these changes into their sensory world. A shift in the smell of a weapon, the sound of a tool being made, the altered silhouette of a hunter approaching through brush, each detail can provoke new vigilance behaviours. Early humans who carried hardened spears likely moved differently. Their approach may have been quieter, more purposeful, more confident. Animals, attuned to subtle shifts, would have noticed. They would have sensed the difference in stride rhythm, the lingering smoke on fur or skin, the way humans spent more time near particular trees where selective wood had been cut. These sensory cues leave no direct trace in the archaeological record, yet they remain consistent with everything we can infer from animal behaviour in both ancient and modern contexts. Carcass scatter patterns confirm the broader picture. In older layers, where untreated wooden spears were used, remains appear in more chaotic distributions, reflecting prolonged chases and higher failure rates. But in later horizons associated with hardened points, the kill sites become more compact. Animals died sooner after initial impact, meaning carcasses accumulated in smaller, more predictable clusters. This, in turn, influenced how other predators and scavengers behaved, creating new ecological tension lines around human hunting grounds. Some species began avoiding these zones altogether, their tracks diverging around the areas of repeated human success. We do not know for certain how quickly animals learned to fear the new spear, but the evidence suggests the change was rapid enough to alter prey ecology across entire regions. That learning, written across landscapes rather than in any single moment, reflects an intelligence often underestimated. Prey animals did not merely react. They integrated experience into movement, into where they slept, into how they formed herds, and into which routes they used during seasonal migrations. A hardened spear tip, invisible to us now except in rare preserved fragments, thus had consequences far beyond its physical presence. It reshaped the behaviours of creatures who had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to interpret the threat of predators with fine-tuned precision. There is a quiet humility in this realization. Humans learned to improve a weapon. animals learned to read that improvement. The spear altered the hunter, but it altered the hunted too, widening the sensory gap between species and introducing a new kind of dialogue, one written in distance, attention, and flight. To understand this shift is to see that prehistory was not a one-sided drama of human innovation. It was an entangled negotiation, where every improvement on one side demanded adjustment on the other. And so when we imagine that moment, an animal pausing, hearing a footfall, recognizing something sharper in the world, we acknowledge a truth older than our own species. Survival is shared learning. Humans refined the spear. Prey refined their fear. Each move prompted another. Each innovation echoed beyond intention. What began as a simple change in the hardness of wood became a transformation of entire ecosystems. It shaped the distribution of herds, the concentration of predators, and the rhythms of migration. A small improvement in a tool extended into the behaviours of thousands of animals over thousands of years. This is the scale at which early technology already operated, quietly, incrementally, and with a reach far beyond the hand that held it. And the humans carrying that wood learned to shape it further. You can also see the change in the quieter parts of the record, in the subtle signals left by species not usually considered central to human hunting strategies. Small browsers and mixed feeders, such as early deer species, begin appearing more frequently on higher, wind-exposed ridges during periods when human activity increased in the valleys. Their movement suggests they were pushing themselves into terrain that offered poorer forage but better visibility. Some of these ridges show repeated trampling surfaces, compacted lines of hoof impressions that speak of animals choosing exposure over concealment, a trade-off rarely made unless the threat below became too unpredictable. These behavioural pivots highlight something profound. Prey were not only responding to the lethality of the hardened spear, they were responding to a growing inconsistency in where humans chose to hunt, as confidence in stronger weapon tips allowed hunters to move more freely and attempt encounters in micro-habitats once considered marginal. That shift echoes in predator guilds as well. Scavenger species such as hyenas and early canids show modified toothmark patterns on bones from this period. The distribution of their gnawing suggests they encountered carcasses sooner after death than before, meaning the kill phase had become more decisive. This created new timing pressures. Scavengers needed to approach more quickly, or risk losing access entirely. Some sites preserve alternating layers of human hunting debris and rapid carnivore intrusion, revealing an intensified competition around carcass availability. Even vultures, detectable through the isotope signatures in their bones, appear to have shifted to slightly different foraging territories when humans improved their efficiency. These ripple effects show that the hardened spear operated not only at the point of impact, but across a web of species whose survival depended on reading human behaviour accurately. In certain regions, sediment patterns around watering holes also reveal changes that align with rising human predation pressure. The trampled mud zones shrink in later layers, implying that animals reduce the time spent lingering in open water margins. Some species began approaching only at dusk or dawn, exploiting moments when visibility for humans was lower. These compressed access windows left their own signatures: narrower hoof clusters, more frantic overlapping prints, and sediment displacement consistent with hurried drinking rather than relaxed presence. Prey species were adopting schedules shaped not by climate or predators alone, but by the evolving properties of a human-made object. We do not know for certain whether early humans recognized these shifts in real time, or whether the changes blended into the background of their seasonal routines. But the evidence suggests a widening feedback loop. As prey became more vigilant and landscapes became more contested, humans refined their strategies in parallel. What began as a sharper point of wood became a catalyst for behavioural adaptations, extending far beyond the boundaries of the hunt itself. It altered where animals slept, how they grouped, which paths they chose, and how other predators responded to their changing patterns. In this way, the hardened spear left its mark not only on bone, but on the movement of entire ecosystems, shaping an ancient choreography of threat and response that would continue to evolve in the millennia that followed, and the humans carrying that wood learned to shape it further. Imagine holding a simple branch and realizing, perhaps for the first time in our species' long memory, that its shape mattered as much as its strength. Picture an early human turning a length of green wood slowly in their hands, sensing how the thickness along its body changed the way it flexed, how the narrowing of its point altered the direction of pressure when it met flesh or bark. Before mathematics had symbols or names, before angles or ratios were anything more than instinct, geometry was already creeping its way into human life. It did not arrive as abstraction, it arrived as survival. And it arrived because someone noticed that the relationship between form and force could mean the difference between a clean kill and a wounded animal vanishing into the brush. What if I told you that some of the earliest evidence for human reasoning appears not in carvings or cave art, but in the quiet standardization of wooden spears? Their proportions, their taper, the balance between thick and thin, strong and slender, all whisper of a mind beginning to measure without measuring, to calculate without calculation, to discover that the world has rules and that tools work better when they follow them. Archaeology allows us to see the beginnings of this discovery in the wood itself. Comparative analyses of ancient spears, from the waterlogged preserves of Central Europe to the scattered wooden fragments recovered in lakeshore muck across parts of Eastern Africa, show that early humans were not merely stripping branches and carving points. They were selecting diameters with increasing precision. A spear with a thick midshaft and a carefully reduced distal end appears again and again across unrelated sites, as though different groups were arriving independently at the same conclusion. That weight distribution mattered. Ethnographic parallels from much later societies confirm what experiments make clear. When the shaft is too slender, the point wavers and deflects on impact. When the shaft is too thick, the spear becomes unwieldy, exhausting the arm before the hunt has even begun. Somewhere in between lies an optimum, and although early humans could not have named the ratio, they found it with their hands, their eyes, and the cumulative memory of many hunts. Experimental archaeologists replicating these ancient tools with seasoned hardwoods have demonstrated just how narrow that optimum can be. When researchers recreate spears with variations of only a few millimeters in diameter, penetration depth, tip stability, and shaft vibration shift significantly. A slightly thicker grip allows the wielder to control torque during a thrust. A gradual taper toward the point increases accuracy by reducing oscillation during the forward drive. These experiments do more than test functional performance. They reveal the sensitivity of the craft itself. A spear that appears simple is in fact the crystallization of countless small decisions that imply an understanding of proportionality long before proportionality was formalized. The hunter who shaped such a weapon did not need geometry in any explicit sense. They needed experience, repetition, and the ability to perceive pattern in the world around them. And that, in its earliest form, is geometry. Across different regions, repeated patterns emerge. At certain lakeshore sites, multiple spears exhibit nearly identical relationships between shaft thickness and point taper, despite being recovered from separate layers and different episodes of occupation. elsewhere, the distribution of fragments suggests that groups were bringing nearly finished spears into particular areas to make final adjustments. The similarities between these objects are not accidental. They point toward informal templates, passed down through memory, demonstration, or simple shared experience. Even without a written system, even without conscious articulation, groups were standardizing the shape of their tools. Archaeologists refer to this as embodied mathematics, knowledge that resides not in symbols or extracted rules, but in muscle memory and repeated practice. A maker learns by doing, and over generations the craft refines itself into a coherent, though unspoken, geometry. Sometimes the evidence appears in the smallest traces. On certain preserved spear shafts, microscopic examination has revealed subtle shaving marks that run at consistent angles along the taper, suggesting deliberate shaping rather than natural wear or opportunistic trimming. The maker was following a known pattern, one that controlled the spear's centre of mass. We do not know whether these patterns were explained aloud, or whether apprentices learned simply by watching elders produce the same form repeatedly. What the archaeological record tells us is that the shapes were not random. They were the products of attentive minds responding to the demands of the hunt. In a world without metal, without adhesives, stronger than sap or sinew, the only way to improve a weapon's performance was to think with the material at hand. This required the hunter to imagine the spear not just as an object, but as an extension of force. A spear thrust into the ribs of a large herbivore placed enormous stress on the shaft. Too much flex and the point would skid off bone. Too little and the weapon would snap upon impact. Understanding this required an appreciation of balance, symmetry, and proportion. Concepts that would later become formal geometry, but were already being felt in the hand long before they were ever written down. What may be most striking is the evidence for regional variation. In some areas, spears exhibit a pronounced midshaft bulge before tapering. In others, the shaft narrows almost continuously from the grip to the point. These differences hint at variations in prey behaviour, local wood species, and hunting techniques. But they also speak to different ways of solving the same physical problem. When anthropologists examine later hunter-gatherer toolkits, they often find that groups living only a few days' travel apart exhibit sharply distinct preferences in weapon shape. If such diversity existed in the recent past, it likely existed in deeper time as well. What unites these traditions, however, is not the specific shape but the underlying reasoning, the recognition that form controls function. Standardization, even in its earliest form, is not merely a technical achievement. It is a cognitive one. When multiple tools share the same proportions, it implies that their makers were thinking beyond the immediate moment. They were producing objects according to a remembered ideal, one that might have been developed through trial and error over many hunts. This memory, encoded in the craft rather than in words, represents one of the earliest forms of technological tradition. It signals continuity across generations, a shared sense of how a tool should feel, behave, and perform. It is the shape of thought preserved in wood. What we often forget is that every piece of geometry embodied in these objects had to be discovered without prior models. There were no rulers, no angle gauges, no mathematical treatises guiding the hand. There was only the accumulated experience of countless small decisions, shaving away a sliver of bark here, adjusting the taper there, checking the straightness of the shaft against the line of the horizon, testing its balance by letting it roll gently across the palm. Through these actions, early humans were not only crafting spears, they were crafting the first intuitions about how the physical world responds to shape. In time, these intuitions would lead to far more complex tools, but their roots lie in these simple wooden forms. When we speak of the origins of engineering, of physics, of applied mathematics, we tend to imagine monumental achievements. Yet the earlier steps were far quieter. They were taken beside small fires in shaded forest clearings, along lake shores where the reflection of the spear on the water might have helped the maker judge its symmetry. The spear was not just a weapon. It was a teacher. It taught that the world has predictable patterns, that force can be guided, that shape carries meaning, and so the realization emerges, soft but clear. Geometry entered human life not as numbers, but as survival. A tapered shaft, a carefully shaped point, a grip that fit the hand just so. These were the first lessons in how the physical world complies with rules. Humans did not need a mathematical language to feel these rules. They needed only the desire to improve a tool that connected them to their prey and to the land itself. If we look even closer at the preserved fragments of early spears, another pattern begins to emerge, one less obvious but no less telling. Some shafts show subtle corrections, minute bends straightened through steaming, small knots shaved flush with the grain, gentle counter curves introduced to offset natural warping. These adjustments are not the marks of someone simply stripping a branch and hoping for the best. They reveal an intimate familiarity with wood as a living material, one whose structure needed to be read like a landscape. To correct a natural curve without splintering the fibres required both patience and insight, the ability to sense where the internal stresses lay, and how far a shaft could be coaxed without failing. This, too, is an early expression of geometric reasoning, not the geometric of lines and angles, but the deeper geometry of physical properties, how tension travels, how compression disperses, how form holds together under pressure. Such knowledge does not come fully formed, it arises through cycles of failure and attention. A hunter who saw a spear break prematurely might remember the weakness of that particular grain pattern. A young craftsperson watching an elder shave a shaft might notice how they paused over a knot, how the blade angled differently there, as if tracing an invisible map inside the wood. When multiple generations encounter the same materials under similar environmental pressures, they gradually accumulate a shared intuition about structural behaviour. This is the foundation of tradition, not in the cultural sense alone, but in the geometric sense. Tradition as the consistent reproduction of an optimal form shaped by the laws of the physical world. What is striking is how these intuitions affected not just the spear itself, but the way people perceived their surroundings. Once a group understood the benefits of certain shaft diameters or tapers, their eyes would naturally be drawn to trees that offered those qualities. A forest, previously an undifferentiated expanse, became a library of possibilities. Straight young saplings offered linear strength. Older trees with denser heartwood provided resilience. Each species presented its own geometric vocabulary, and over time the landscape became readable in terms of potential shapes, stresses, and uses. This growing ability to see geometry in nature represented a significant cognitive shift, one that influenced decisions far beyond tool-making. And perhaps this is where the deepest transformation quietly unfolded. When early humans learned that shape could be predicted and controlled, they also learned to anticipate how a tool would behave before it was ever finished. This anticipation, this mental rehearsal of form and function, marks the first stirrings of abstract thinking in technological practice. The spearmaker envisioned the finished object long before it existed. They carried not just a branch, but an intention shaped by memory, reasoning, and embodied mathematics. In this sense, geometry was no longer confined to wood. It had entered the human mind, establishing a way of thinking that would eventually underpin architecture, navigation, and every later technology that relied on understanding how form channels force, and from geometry came a quieter transformation, material choice. You're walking through a forest that does not yet have names for its trees, a forest in which lineage and taxonomy have never been spoken aloud, but where every trunk, every towering column of cellulose and light carries a quiet biography of strength, brittleness, growth rate, and grain. Now imagine that someone long before written language and long before anyone could articulate what tensile strength meant, began to see those biographies. They noticed the way some saplings bounced back when bent, while others snapped at a shallow angle. They noticed how certain woods darkened in fire grew rigid and took on a clean, narrow point under slow rotation and scraping. This was the beginning of an understanding that could not be written because writing did not yet exist. Yet it lived as clearly as any instruction manual. It lived in memory, in practice, in the choices people made before stepping toward anything dangerous. And that is where the transformation began, not in a single invention, but in a growing awareness that some trees were simply better at becoming weapons than others. We do not know whether these early humans had a formal word for the kinds of wood they preferred. What we do know, based on the distribution of preserved spears and shafts recovered from waterlogged sites across Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia, is that they were not selecting trees at random. The spears found at Schöningen, for instance, were crafted primarily from spruce and pine, woods that combine predictable straightness with a manageable density. Other sites show an emphasis on hazel, birch, and occasionally ash. No single species was universally preferred. Instead, there was a regionally specific pattern that mirrored local ecology. In places where spruce formed the dense understory, straight saplings of even diameter became the norm. In more temperate zones, where hazel grew in thick, uniform stands, its flexible stems were repeatedly chosen. The pattern suggests not mere opportunism, but familiarity. People had spent generations learning which trees could withstand the stresses of thrusting or throwing, and which ones might fail at exactly the wrong moment. Mechanical testing conducted on modern analogues of these wood species shows why these choices mattered. Hazel, for example, has a remarkable capacity to retain elasticity even after heating, allowing a spear to absorb the shock of impact without catastrophic breakage. Spruce, once thermally modified, hardens beyond its untreated counterpart while remaining light enough to lift, carry and accelerate repeatedly. Ash, when available, offers a unique balance of weight and stiffness, producing tips that can penetrate deeply without splintering. Fire does not treat every species equally. Some woods turn brittle under heat, some char too quickly, and some simply refuse to take your point well. The archaeological record suggests that early humans recognized this long before any formal testing existed. They learned by trial, by repetition, by watching which tools succeeded and which ones failed. Over thousands of seasons, the species that yielded the most reliable weapons were chosen again and again, quietly shaping the landscape of preferred timber. This knowledge is visible not only in the trees themselves, but also in the distances travelled to procure them. Sites located in open grasslands still contain spear shafts, made from forest species that didn't grow anywhere nearby. The implication is clear. Early humans carried wood across landscapes because the right wood mattered. Some shafts found in Middle Pleistocene contexts were transported several kilometres from their nearest possible source, significant investment of time and energy when carrying anything long, rigid, and unwieldy. The spear was not merely something fashioned from whatever branch lay close at hand. It was a deliberate object, a product of selection and transportation, a tool whose reliability began long before the hunt itself. Even when prey was abundant and ecosystems were forgiving, the choice of wood reflects a mentality that prioritized consistency. Not every moment in early human life came with the luxury of error. Tree ring evidence provides another layer to this understanding. When archaeologists examine the growth patterns preserved in ancient wooden tools, they find a striking tendency. Many spears were crafted from saplings harvested during dormant seasons, when sap levels were lowest and the wood's internal moisture content most stable. Winter-cut wood behaves differently from summer-cut wood. It warps less, dries more evenly, and responds to heat with a cleaner, more controlled transformation. The fact that so many preserved examples show this seasonal pattern implies foresight. People were not cutting branches spontaneously during a hunt. They were gathering them months in advance. A spear made from a winter-harvested sapling would take time to transform. It needed drying, scraping, shaping, and careful thermal exposure. This means the earliest fire-hardened spears were not born from immediacy or crisis. They were born from intention. They were planned. A final dimension lies in the microscopic residue still clinging to some of these ancient tools. High magnification analysis reveals traces of scraping techniques, suggesting that bark removal and surface preparation were conducted with remarkable precision. Different woods leave different residues when shaved. Birch, for example, flakes cleanly under a sharp stone edge, leaving long, narrow shavings, while spruce tends to tear unless scraped along the grain at a precise angle. These residues show that early humans were already adapting their methods to the properties of each species. They developed ways of working with the material that acknowledged its internal structure. They were learning slowly and quietly to read the forest in terms of possibility. All of this reveals a deeper truth. The forest was not simply a place of shelter and fuel. It was a catalogue of potential shapes, densities, and strengths. It was a silent archive of materials that could either fail or preserve life. Humans learned, generation by generation, to read that archive with increasing sensitivity. They could distinguish between a sapling that grew too quickly and one that grew just slowly enough to be straight, dense, and reliable. They recognized how grain orientation affected impact resistance. They knew how to find a balance between flexibility and hardness. Even if they lacked the vocabulary we use today, the understanding was no less sophisticated. The forest became a library, and the people who moved through it became its readers. And once they began to read that library, something subtle but irreversible occurred. The tools they crafted from those trees began to shape not only how they hunted or defended themselves, but how they moved, how they thought, and how they behaved in their daily lives. The spear, once an opportunistic extension of the arm, became a governed artifact, shaped by knowledge rather than instinct. The people who carried it learned to trust certain species, to anticipate the failures of others, to return to specific groves season after season, and to pass this understanding down to those who would need it long after the original trees had fallen. The memory of which wood worked best became part of their culture long before it became part of their archaeology. It is worth pausing to remember that all this happened without the abstraction of science, without written records, without formal measurable language. It was embodied knowledge, held in the hands and in the grain. A person standing beside a sapling could feel its potential simply by bending it. A person scraping a length of wood could sense its resistance through the vibration travelling back into the wrist. And when that wood finally touched fire, the transformation could be read through sound, smell, colour, and resistance. These were observations, not analyses, but they were no less precise. They formed a body of understanding that allowed humans to adapt to new terrains, to hunt more effectively, and to survive conditions that might otherwise have been beyond their reach. In this way, the forest itself became an extension of human cognition. It shaped their decisions, their strategies, their movements, and their long-term planning. It taught them that tools could be more than simple objects. They could be improved, refined, and optimized through careful attention. And this emerging sense of refinement, this willingness to perfect rather than merely use, would eventually open the door to more dramatic transformations in human technology. But before that came another shift, one that reached inward rather than outward. The tools they carried began to change their bodies, and what they carried began to change their bodies. There is another layer to this story, one that sits not in the wood itself, but in the landscapes where those trees grew. When archaeologists examine ancient procurement zones, they notice that people were not selecting trees randomly scattered across the environment. Instead, they were drawn to very specific ecological micro-regions, the margins of wetlands where straight saplings grow tall in competition for light, the edges of river terraces where seasonal flooding produces uniform stands, and the high, thin soils where slower-growing species produce dense, tight-grained wood. These clusters show a remarkable alignment with what modern forestry science identifies as ideal growth conditions for tool-quality timber. In other words, people were not only choosing certain species, they were choosing the right versions of those species, shaped by the right ecological pressures. This suggests that the knowledge embedded in their choices was broader than a single tree or object. It was a landscape-level awareness. Some of the clearest evidence for this comes from the spacing of tool production debris. At several sites, the majority of shaping flakes, bark remnants, and scraping residues do not appear at the kill sites where spears were used. Instead, they cluster at the edges of those timber-rich areas. There, archaeologists find piles of cleaned bark, carved off knots, and trimmed ends, material that would have been cumbersome to carry elsewhere. The people who made these tools were shaping them near the source, preparing shafts in concentrated working zones long before taking them on long journeys. It implies planning not only of the tool itself, but of the labour, the logistics, and even the weight humans wish to carry across uneven terrain. Wood was transformed where wood grew best. The spear was born in the forest, and only later entered the hunt. Some residues also reveal the use of abrasive materials gathered deliberately from other parts of the environment. Quartzite dust, river sand, and crushed ochre appear in microscopic grooves on ancient shafts. Their presence tells us that early humans were not merely scraping wood with stone. They were polishing, smoothing, and correcting imperfections with a surprising level of precision. These abrasives allowed a shaft to be trued, its surface unified so that airflow, rotation, and balance remained consistent. Even the slightest irregularity could compromise a weapon's reliability, and it appears people recognized this long before aerodynamic studies existed. They were already compensating for grain twist, countering natural curvature, and reinforcing sections where a knot might weaken performance. Their knowledge of the forest did not stop at the species level. It extended into the physics of movement. This growing sophistication had broader implications. Once humans learned that the characteristics of wood were not fixed, once they understood that a tree's potential depended on its season of harvest, its environment of growth, its grain orientation, and its treatment with fire, the boundaries of technology began to loosen. Wood was no longer a given. It became something that could be predicted, shaped, improved, and tailored. This shift allowed future innovations to emerge not as accidents but as experiments. People who understood that materials have hidden rules were already on the path toward manipulating stone, bone, and eventually metal. The spear was the beginning of a deeper curiosity, a belief that nature was not simply something to endure, but something to negotiate with. In this sense, the forest also became a teacher of patience. To harvest a sapling at the right time, to dry it slowly, to scrape away its bark without cutting too deeply, to expose it to fire in controlled increments, none of this aligned with urgency. It required delayed gratification, a recognition that the best spear tomorrow might be worth the labour spent today. This, too, shaped the societies that used them. A culture that plans its weapons in advance is a culture that begins to imagine its future. It was this imagination, more than the wood itself, that marked the turning point. And it is why the transformation of trees into weapons must be understood not simply as craftsmanship, but as a quiet expansion of human identity. People did not just sharpen branches. They entered into a dialogue with the material, learning its limits and possibilities, and in doing so, came to understand their own. The forest became a library, and humans learned to read grain. And what they carried began to change their bodies. A body shaped not by the landscape it walked, nor by the animals it hunted, but by the tool it returned to again and again. A body learning, without language, to echo the motion of something it had created with intention. When we look at ancient skeletons, we seldom imagine them in motion, yet bones, in their quiet way, keep records of the forces that once passed through them. They remember, and if we listen closely, they tell us that the fire-hardened spear did not merely sharpen the world outside the hunter, it carved itself into the hunter as well. What if I told you that the first signatures of engineered weapons are written not in soil, nor in hearths, but in the arm and shoulder girdle of people who lived hundreds of thousands of years ago? Archaeologists studying 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 from early and middle Pleistocene contexts have observed patterns that are not random, nor easily explained by generalized labor. These bones show enlarged attachment sites where muscles once anchored with unusual strength. They show ridges where repeated force pulled again and again. They show a symmetry, subtle but unmistakable, between the arm that thrust and the arm that steadied, and they appear precisely in the populations who relied on hardened wooden spears. The fire did not just strengthen the weapon, it strengthened and strained the body holding it. Enthesial changes, the small expansions, and lipping around tendon and ligament attachments provide some of the clearest clues. In individuals associated with thrust-based hunting, the areas where the deltoid, pectoral, triceps and rotator cuff muscles meet bone are notably more pronounced. These are not the signatures of occasional use. They belong to people whose lives required repeated forward-driving motions, stabilizing impacts, and quick recoveries. When the spear's hardened tip began to allow deeper penetration, the forces transferred back into the body increased as well. The hunter had to absorb recoil, redirect momentum, and maintain balance after each strike. Over a lifetime, the skeleton reshaped itself to accommodate the demands of the weapon. Other evidence lives in the torso. Vertebrae and lower ribs from several sites exhibit robusticity beyond what one would expect from simple locomotion. Some researchers interpret these as adaptations to the torsional stresses involved in coordinated thrusting. A hardened spear behaved differently than a raw branch. It bit into tissue with greater resistance, requiring the hunter to twist, brace, and sometimes wrench the weapon free. Each of those motions placed torque through the spine and rib cage. Over years and generations, this produced patterns that appear across regions yet converge on the same behavior: deliberate, repeated, high-force thrusting. The body needed to rotate, and so it did. Asymmetry provides another layer. In most populations, slight right-left differences reflect handedness, but in spear-using groups, these asymmetries intensify. The thrusting arm shows thicker cortical bone, greater cross-sectional area, and more developed muscle attachment points. Meanwhile, the stabilizing arm shows a different profile, one shaped by bracing the shaft, guiding its direction, and absorbing lateral forces. These paired asymmetries reveal a choreography, an instrument held in two hands but relying on one to generate power and the other to control precision. Even without preserved spears, the bodies alone would tell us that technology had become a habit. Comparisons with earlier hominins highlight what changed. Species such as Homo erectus possess strong shoulders and deep chests, suited for endurance and general manual force. But the subtle refinements seen in later Homo sapiens and Neanderthal populations, especially the strengthening of the rotator cuff area and the stress patterns associated with fine control, point towards specialized use, not generalized labor. Something about the fire-hardened spear demanded precision, repetition, and coordination, and the body adapted accordingly, becoming not only a carrier of tools, but a collaborator in their evolution. Rib robusticity studies add one final piece. In several Pleistocene contexts, ribs exhibit thickened shafts and remodeled surfaces that suggest repeated forward-driving bracing. When thrusting at close range, hunters had to stabilize the spear with their torso, leaning into the strike with controlled but substantial force. The hardened tip, more resistant and durable, encouraged deeper attempts and more confident engagements. This new reliability in the weapon demanded a new reliability in posture. Over time, bodies learned to meet this demand with strengthened intercostal attachments and reinforced thoracic musculature. The spear was changing, the body followed. All of this points to a quiet truth. Humans did not simply invent tools. Tools invented humans. By choosing to modify wood with fire, by choosing to rely on a weapon that required commitment of body and mind, early people entered into a feedback loop of craft and anatomy. The hardened spear asked for strength in new places, flexibility in others, and endurance that could match the rhythms of the hunt. And bodies listened. They did what bodies always do when faced with pattern. They changed. The result was not merely a stronger arm or a more resilient shoulder. It was a body shaped by foresight, a body sculpted by intention, long before intention ever shaped stone or metal. In this sense, the fire-hardened spear is not only a technological milestone, it is an evolutionary one. For the first time, a tool required the body to become something else in order to use it fully, and the body, in becoming something else, opened new possibilities for the tool, and reshaped bodies altered how groups confronted one another. Two humans facing one another with nothing but a few steps between them, yet carrying in their hands something that did not exist a few generations earlier. A piece of wood, altered by fire, sharpened beyond the limits of nature, held not just as a tool but as a decision waiting to be made. In that narrow breath between bodies, before any movement occurred, the world of human conflict had already changed. What if I told you that the first evidence for human against human violence shaped by engineered weapons is not written in the soil, nor in abandoned camps, but in the bones of the people themselves? Archaeologists studying early and middle Pleistocene remains have found punctures that go far deeper than accidental injury. These wounds cut directly through ribs, pierce pelvic plates, and enter vertebrae at angles that suggest one thing alone: a deliberate strike delivered at close range. There is no sign of projectile trauma here, no distant kill, no arc of flight. This was confrontation carried out arm's length from another person, and the tool used, a hardened wooden spear, had already begun to alter not only how humans hunted, but how they opposed one another. The revelation emerges gradually, like a faint stain on bone slowly becoming legible under laboratory light. Several skeletons show deep puncture wounds consistent with thrusting weapons. The edges of these lesions are smooth, not serrated, exactly what a fire-hardened point would leave. Some pass entirely through major bones, entering from the front and exiting through the back. Others travel obliquely, suggesting a downward thrust made during a struggle. These injuries exceed what untreated wood could do. A raw branch may bruise or splinter, but to pierce cortical bone with such clarity requires a compressed, stiffened tip. This is the signature of heat. Territorial models help explain why such encounter occurred. During cooler phases of the Pleistocene, resource-rich patches, water sources, migration choke points, and forested valleys became magnets for multiple groups. Scarcity narrowed movement corridors. Groups that once drifted past one another found themselves compressed into the same grazing grounds, the same gathering sites, the same river approaches where large animals predictably crossed. When resources tightened, interaction shifted from avoidance to negotiation, and from negotiation to conflict. The fire-hardened spear, already essential for hunting, became a tool for defense and assertion, long before weapons were designed expressly for war. Ethnographic parallels lend context without imposing anachronism. In some modern societies where hardened wooden spears remained part of ritualized combat into the 20th century, close-range confrontations were governed by strict codes. The weapon demanded courage because it demanded proximity. A hardened spear could maim or kill, but using it meant entering the reach of the opponent's own strike. The lesson from these parallels is not that Pleistocene humans practiced ritual combat. We cannot assume that. Rather, it is that hardened wood, as a category of weapon, inherently encourages a kind of conflict that is both intimate and decisive. It carries with it an expectation of personal presence. Artistic depictions from later periods hint at something similar. The spear as extension of posture, of stance, of identity within a group. Although such drawings do not date to the era of the first fire-hardened points, they reveal a long-standing association between spears and social display. Imagery of standing lines of spear-bearers, of individuals holding points upright during ceremonies, of warriors depicted with arms locked in thrusting position, all reinforce a fact the archaeology quietly suggests. Carrying a hardened spear was a statement. It signalled readiness, but also intention. The social implications of such a weapon are profound. A fire-hardened spear required courage to use in conflict, because it did not create distance, it required closing distance. Unlike later projectile technologies, which allowed individuals to threaten one another from safety, the hardened spear demanded presence. Two bodies had to approach close enough that breath, tension, and fear were shared. In that narrow space, conflict became a test not only of strength but of willingness to act. And yet, precisely because the spear demanded courage, it also restrained violence. A weapon that requires intimacy cannot be used casually. It demands commitment. This is visible in population density models that correlate conflict frequency with zones of severe scarcity rather than zones of mere inconvenience. Early spears were not tools of opportunistic aggression. They were tools of necessity. When the archaeological record shows interpersonal spear wounds, it often corresponds to periods when food was unpredictable, when territories overlapped, when mobility was restricted by climate, or when groups found themselves unable to avoid one another. What emerges from all this evidence is a quiet but unmistakable truth. The hardened spear created the first distance within conflict. Not physical distance, there was none, but conceptual distance. A person holding a hardened spear was no longer simply reacting. They were choosing. They were deciding whether to thrust, whether to advance, whether to cross the final steps that separated confrontation from injury. In that hesitation, in that pause between recognition and action, intention appeared. The spear did not yet separate bodies, but it separated thought from impulse. It introduced the possibility of deliberate violence, not merely reactive violence. This moment matters because it signals the earliest transition from tools used to survive the world to tools used to negotiate the human world. The fire-hardened spear did not create war. It did not create territorialism. Those forces run far deeper. But it created a medium through which those forces could be expressed with greater clarity. And in doing so, it paved the way for ritual, for signalling, for negotiation, for deterrence, and for the structured conflict that would shape later societies. The hardened spear was not yet distance, but it was already intention. It was the first weapon in which the human mind left an imprint deeper than the flame that shaped its point. The first in which the body learned to inhabit a new posture, not only against animals but against one another, and the first in which conflict became an extension of thought. It is tempting to imagine these encounters only as moments of sudden violence, but the archaeological record suggests something quieter layered beneath them. Many of the puncture wounds preserved in early human remains show signs of partial healing, a reminder that not every confrontation ended in death. Some individuals survive spear injuries long enough for new bone to grow across the edges of the lesion, leaving a raised, remodeled surface. This means conflict was not always fatal. It could be warning, punishment, discipline, or assertion. A hardened spear thrust did not need to kill to convey meaning. It simply had to reach bone. And here another dimension of spear conflict becomes visible: the communicative power of injury. In groups where hunting tools doubled as weapons, a wound could function as a message. Too deep to be accidental, yet not placed to kill, it spoke of boundaries crossed or roles challenged. The fire-hardened spear carried into human-human interactions a vocabulary far older than speech, a grammar of force, proximity, and restraint. The archaeology of healed punctures suggests that early humans were already navigating a world in which conflict could be expressed in degrees rather than absolutes. Yet these interactions were not only between opponents, they reverberated across whole communities. A wounded hunter needed care. A group losing a strong member, even temporarily, had to redistribute gathering, defense, and hunting tasks. The presence of injuries that required weeks of recovery tells us something profound. These societies tended to their wounded. Someone cleaned the wound. Someone protected the injured from further harm. Someone carried their share of work until they healed. In this way, the fire-hardened spear reshaped cooperation as much as it reshaped conflict. A weapon that could create deep punctures forced groups to confront the reality of shared vulnerability. There is another layer still, one written not in bone but in geography. Sites showing evidence of interpersonal spear trauma often appear near transitional zones, the margins between forest and open plain, the edges of river valleys, or the perimeters of cave systems that served as temporary shelters. These boundaries offered opportunity, but also tension. They were places where resources shifted quickly with season or climate, where different groups converged by necessity rather than preference. In such liminal spaces, the hardened spear acquired symbolic weight. It became a presence before it became a threat, an object whose mere visibility could diffuse a confrontation or escalate it. The emotional landscape of these encounters cannot be fully recovered, but the archaeological signatures allow us to glimpse something about the moment before violence occurred. The grip on the shaft would have tightened, breath would have slowed. The knowledge of what the tool could do would have sharpened awareness on both sides. In that instant, conflict was not yet action. It was a horizon of possibilities. The fire-hardened spear shaped that horizon by lending weight to intention and consequence. And perhaps the most striking insight is that even without distance, the hardened spear introduced choice. Unlike the natural branch used in panic or desperation, this tool carried the mark of preparation. Its presence signaled that someone had taken time, effort, and foresight to create it. This imbued every confrontation with an added layer of meaning. A blow delivered with such a weapon was not just a strike of opportunity, but an act involving the accumulated labour of days. It was a gesture tied to memory, effort, and planning. This alone shifted the psychological terrain of conflict. The fire-hardened spear therefore occupies a unique position in human evolution. It sits between improvisation and engineering, between reaction and intention, between instinctive violence and deliberate force. It represents the first moment when humans brought the logic of tool-making into their relationships with one another, when they used a crafted object not just to confront the world outside, but to negotiate the tensions within their own species, and reshaped bodies altered how groups confronted one another. Imagine this, a spear lying beside a body not because it killed, but because it meant something. In soils where wood should have vanished long ago, impressions and fragments sometimes remain in positions too deliberate for chance, aligned with limbs or set parallel to the spine, as if the last gesture made toward the dead was not touch, but placement. What if I told you that the fire-hardened spear began leaving traces not only in hunts and conflicts, but in the quieter spaces where people gathered to remember, to initiate, to define what belonging meant? These moments rarely fossilize, but the faint shadows they leave suggest a shift in how early humans understood themselves and each other. The spear was no longer only a tool, it had become a sign. We do not know for certain when people first laid a hardened spear beside someone who would never rise to use it again, but carefully nested spear fragments in several early burials argue strongly for intention. Their angles are too clean, too aligned with anatomical orientation, sometimes following lines of the torso as though the object remained part of an identity the mourners refused to strip away. In a few sites, broken points are clustered near the chest or pelvis, not splintered by decay but snapped before deposition, a gesture seen in many later cultures when an item is symbolically killed to accompany a person into another kind of existence. Other burials contain only the dark streak of decayed wood, a linear stain extending from the shoulder toward the feet, indistinguishable to the untrained eye but unmistakable under chemical and microscopic analysis. Even in dissolution, the spear holds its shape in memory. Rock surfaces tell a related story. Regions separated by great distances show engraved or pecked silhouettes of long shafts ending not in stone points, but in the simpler taper of wood. These representations often appear in clusters associated with gatherings, wide panels that show groups arranged in lines, sometimes with certain figures holding the elongated symbol more prominently. While the meaning of any prehistoric image is uncertain, the recurrent emphasis on the spear as an identity marker points to the possibility that the weapon signified more than its immediate use. A community that chooses to depict a tool repeatedly is recording something about values, stories, or aspirations. In many traditions with historical continuity, such images preserve the essence of ceremony long after the rituals themselves vanish. Ethnographic parallels, though used cautiously, help illuminate how a fire-modified spear could enter symbolic realms. In several societies where hardened wooden spears remain culturally central, the act of crafting one is not merely technical, it is social. Youth watch elders select wood, scrape away bark in long strokes, and hold the emerging shape over the margin of a fire whose heat must be fed and moderated with attention. The hardening is often accompanied by words, chants, or silence with significance. The crafting becomes a passage, a threshold crossed not by receiving the spear but by shaping it. Some groups even maintain strict rules about when the wood may be cut, certain phases of the year, certain stages of personal maturity, or specific circumstances that require communal witnessing. These parallels suggest that something similar may have unfolded tens of thousands of years ago, when the new relationship between fire and wood was still fresh and extraordinary. Archaeological evidence, though faint, supports the idea that craftsmanship itself carried social meaning. At some sites, spear fragments associated with symbolic contexts show subtle distinctions from everyday hunting tools. More carefully balanced diameters, more symmetrical tapers, or traces of fine scraping that exceed functional necessity. The differences are not dramatic, yet they appear consistently enough to hint at a category of spear whose value lay partly in aesthetics or tradition. Some deliberately hardened points are polished beyond what hunting requires, their surfaces smoothed to an even sheen, as though the maker intended the object to be seen, not only used. In other cases, decorations appear not as pigments or engravings, the wood rarely survives well enough for that, but as slight modifications in form that elevate the spear from ordinary utility to representation. These small details accumulate into a picture of an early symbolic economy in which objects mediated identity. If we consider how communities function, it becomes increasingly clear why the fire-hardened spear might evolve into a ceremonial item. Crafting one is neither instantaneous nor thoughtless. It requires anticipation of future events and recognition of the tool's place in them, demands attention to the properties of different woods, careful modulation of heat, and practiced scraping techniques. Each step introduces an opportunity to embed meaning. In many human societies, the ability to create something difficult or refined becomes a marker of adulthood, status, or specialized knowledge. The spear's transformation under fire made visible the patience and judgment of the maker, qualities valued not only in hunting but in leadership and memory. When a person who carries such a spear stands among others, the weapon becomes a message about who they are. Some ceremonies, inferred from pattern deposits and ethnographic analogy, may have involved the deliberate breaking of a spear. The fracture lines found on a subset of burial specimens differ from damage caused by hunting or soil pressure. They are clean, direct, suggestive of controlled force applied with ritual purpose. To break a tool that has required time, effort, and intention is to acknowledge its significance, and to release that significance, or transfer it, or seal it into a moment worth marking. Whether these acts were tied to mourning, initiation, or the commemoration of a particular event is unknown, but the consistency with which such breaks appear hints at more than expedience. Other clues come from the presence of spear motifs near gathering places. These are not hunting grounds, but areas interpreted as seasonal congregation points based on hearth density, artifact diversity, and traces of repeated occupation. Here, spear-related imagery occurs alongside patterns that may represent group movements, animal migrations, or cosmological symbols. The spear appears where people came together to reaffirm ties, exchange information, or engage in rituals that shaped communal identity. Its presence in these contexts implies a role beyond personal possession, something shared, recognized, perhaps even sanctified. This symbolic elevation aligns with broader patterns in early human societies, where tools often bridge the worlds of the practical and the meaningful. A spear hardened by fire invites reflection, because it embodies transformation. The raw branch becomes a refined instrument through a process that is both simple and profound. Heat rearranges the cellular structure, tightening the fibers, strengthening the point. To witness this transformation is to see the world's malleability, and to grasp that knowledge and intention can change what nature provides. It is no surprise that such an object would become entangled with the stories people tell about themselves. As communities grew in complexity, the spear may have served as a visual shorthand for capabilities or roles. A young member who mastered the craft might earn the right to carry a distinctive spear in ceremonies marking maturity. Elders might retain spears with specific histories embedded in their surfaces, signs of hunts, conflicts, or journeys that conferred authority. Spear-making could become a specialized skill held by certain individuals whose knowledge was valued and transmitted through apprenticeship. Each possibility expands the spear's symbolic dimensions, binding it not just to survival but to the social fabric of life. In burials, the positioning of spears relative to bodies suggests that the object acted almost like an extension of identity. Placing it beside the dead was not only a gesture of remembrance, it was a recognition that the spear had accompanied the person through life's trials and accomplishments, and deserved to accompany them in whatever lay beyond. The presence of spear fragments in graves spanning different regions and time periods indicates that this practice persisted long enough to become a tradition, not an isolated custom. Its consistency points to shared underlying ideas about continuity, belonging, and the narrative of a life. Ceremonial uses of fire in relation to spears appear in some ethnographic records, where the heating process itself becomes part of a rite. In these traditions, fire does not simply harden wood, it purifies, strengthens, or reveals. While we cannot assume direct continuity between these practices and prehistoric ones, the repeated association of fire with symbolic transformation across many cultures strengthens the hypothesis that early communities recognized a deeper significance in the act of hardening a spear's point. The glow of the ember along the tip becomes a moment of attention, a quiet parallel to the interchanges required for adulthood, skill, or social recognition. As this symbolic vocabulary expanded, craftsmanship variations themselves began to carry meaning. The particular way a spear was scraped, the thickness of its taper, the curve of its profile, subtle differences might signify clan affiliation, individual achievement, or adherence to a specific tradition. Archaeologists sometimes find clusters of spears within a site that share idiosyncratic features, suggesting that groups developed style signatures that were recognized and valued. Such signatures turn a functional object into a communicative one, a silent statement of identity carried through the landscape. Through all of this, the fire-hardened spear became a story told not in words but in wood, a story of learning, of lineage, of belonging. Its presence in graves, gatherings, and artistic representations marks it as a vessel of human meaning, an object woven into the narrative communities used to understand themselves. Long before metals reshaped warfare and ceremony, the simplest hardened spear served as a symbol of capacity, transformation, and memory. Realization arrives quietly. The fire-hardened spear became more than a tool. It became a story about who one was. Yet the deeper layers of this story appear not in the obvious traces, but in the quiet consistencies that repeat across distant landscapes, suggesting that ceremony attached itself to the spear in ways that outlived particular communities. In several regions, archaeologists have noted that spear-making debris appears not only at domestic sites or hunting camps, but also at liminal places such as river crossings, cliff edges, and transitional zones between forest and open plain. These locations lack indicators of sustained habitation, yet bear small pockets of charcoal, scraped wood shavings, and discarded fragments that resemble the early stages of spear preparation. Their placement suggests that some groups chose to begin or end the crafting of a spear at boundaries, places where the world itself changed texture. Such liminal crafting hints at the idea that a weapon forged through fire might also mark a personal threshold, leaving youth behind, returning from hardship, or stepping into a responsibility recognized by the group. A different kind of evidence emerges from the spatial arrangement of hearths at several sites where ceremonial behaviors are suspected. Some hearths show structured patterns that differ from work-related fire use, forming arcs or enclosed circles that may have defined social space. In a few cases, elongated depressions beside these hearths contain narrow concentrations of heated soil, consistent with repeated placement of wooden shafts close enough to absorb warmth, yet far enough to avoid burning. The regularity of these placements, always at the same angle relative to the central fire, suggests not utilitarian efficiency, but coordinated behaviour, perhaps enacted for shared viewing. When fire hardens wood in such a deliberately arranged setting, the act becomes visible, participatory, and meaningful. There is also the puzzle of spears found in contexts devoid of practical explanation. Some points appear in cave chambers far from light or airflow, in places that would have offered little utility for either hunting preparation or storage. Their location implies that the spear was brought in intentionally, perhaps to leave a presence where people gathered for storytelling, for marking seasons, or for collective rituals whose specific nature we can only infer from archaeological patterning. The choice to carry a hardened spear into darkness says something about how early humans understood symbolic space, a tool transformed by fire entering a space transformed by meaning. Even more telling are the occasions where spear fragments appear alongside pigments or grinding stones used to create them. While pigment on wood rarely survives, the consistent association suggests that colour may once have been applied to ceremonial spears. The act of colouring wood, especially in combination with fire, transforms the spear twice, once chemically, once visually. This dual transformation may have been understood as marking the person who wielded it as someone who had undergone their own internal change. In many later societies, pigments in ceremonial contexts mark affiliation, rank, or a relationship with the unseen world. The presence of such materials near spear fragments gestures toward a similar symbolic layering long before the emergence of more complex artistic traditions. These traces reveal a broader truth. The fire-hardened spear did not become symbolic because people sought symbols. It became symbolic because its making already demanded focus, memory, and sequence. A community whose survival rested partly on such an object could not help but notice the parallels between shaping wood and shaping identity. The spear's straightness echoed the straightness expected of an initiate. Its hardened point mirrored the sharpening of judgment or skill. Its transformation through fire paralleled life's own passages through adversity. The object was never merely itself. As ceremonial meanings accumulated, the spear began to anchor communal narratives that extended beyond individuals. In some regions, distinct spear styles appear at sites separated by considerable distance, implying that certain crafting traditions moved with people as they migrated, mingled, or split apart. When tools travel alongside stories, they become vessels of shared memory. A spear made in one place but found in another carries the imprint of a journey. The landscapes crossed, the relationships formed, the knowledge transported. Its presence in a ceremonial setting becomes not only a sign of personal identity, but a thread binding larger histories. In such ways, the fire-hardened spear entered the realm of the symbolic almost inadvertently, through repetition, through skill, through the recognition that certain actions gained depth when witnessed as part of collective life. And with each new association, the spear grew larger than the hand that held it, becoming something that could speak for a person, a lineage, or a moment that mattered. Imagine a moment when a human crouched beside a small fire and held a branch close enough to the embers for its fibres to tighten, darken, and take on a new resilience. To them it was simply curiosity carried out in the rhythm of the evening. To us it marks something far larger. What if I told you that this was the first time in all of prehistory that a human intentionally altered the internal structure of a material so that it behaved differently afterward? Not a stone found with the right fracture, nor a bone shaped by grinding, but the deliberate reconfiguration of matter through heat. Picture that as the beginning of a lineage that would eventually include pottery kilns, bronze smelting, glassworking, and steel song. The earliest step in a chain of ideas so long and so quiet that its beginning is almost too small to see. We do not know which population first discovered the effect. The evidence appears discontinuously across continents, always older than expected, always arriving without ceremony. What archaeologists can say with reasonable confidence is that the fire-hardened spear represents the first documented case in which humans did not merely select from the natural world but intervened in it, altering its properties so that the world itself behaved differently in response. In charred spear tips examined under microscopy, cell walls collapse in predictable patterns when heated at controlled ranges, turning soft early wood into a more compact and sharper structure. These patterns cannot be produced by accidental burning or random exposure to wildfire. They indicate intention, repetition, and the memory of a desired outcome. From this revelation flows a broader observation that has occupied cognitive archaeologists for decades. There are structural parallels between this earliest thermal modification and the conceptual frameworks that later guided metallurgy. In both cases, heat is used not as a source of destruction, but as a force of transformation. Early metallurgists, many tens of thousands of years later, learned that ore changed colour and texture as temperatures rose, that slag separated from metal, that cooling rates mattered. But the foundation of that relationship between heat and predictability already existed in the quiet work of early humans who realised that fire could participate in craft. Experiments replicating prehistoric hardening techniques show that even small differences in distance from the flame produce measurable changes in point durability. This indicates that early practitioners understood at least the outline of thermal control, even if their vocabulary for it was entirely practical and sensory. The continuity extends beyond heat. The geometry of the hardened spear shares conceptual ancestry with later composite weapons, though the materials differ dramatically. In both cases, humans learned to balance stiffness and flexibility, to adjust weight distribution along a shaft and to refine taper for efficient force transfer. Composite bows, thousands of years later, depended on similar principles, layering materials whose internal stresses work together to store and release energy. Archaeologists studying the earliest known fire-shaped spear points argue that the mental step required to imagine a tool in a future state is more important than the tool itself. That step requires abstraction, projection, and a form of knowledge that is not visible to the eye but held in the mind as a sequence of transformations. To understand the depth of this shift, Consider the difference between using nature and modifying nature. A hand axe knapped from stone responds to the fractures already present in the raw material. A bone awl shaped by grinding responds to the hardness built into its structure. But a fire-hardened spear begins in one state and is deliberately taken to another. It is not found, it is coaxed, it is not given, it is made. This marks the beginning of engineering in the human story, not engineering in the modern sense, but engineering as intention applied to matter. Archaeologists sometimes refer to this moment as the earliest form of planned tool states. It is the recognition that what one holds in one's hand now is not what one intends to hold later, and that the transformation requires knowledge, care, and the ability to predict cause and effect. From here, cultural transmission becomes essential. Thermal hardening leaves only microscopic traces on surviving fragments, but its repeated appearance at far-flung sites suggests that the knowledge moved through populations by teaching and observation. The same clusters of charring in stratified sediments, the same distinctive scraping marks that precede heating, and the same patterns of point symmetry appear too consistently to be coincidental. This tells us that early humans developed reliable methods, passed them through generations, and refined them with time. It points to communities in which individuals carried knowledge about materials not only in their hands but in their memories. It shows that the idea of changing the world through practice, rather than accepting the world as it arrived, had begun to circulate. What emerges from these details is a picture of cognition advancing quietly beside the fire. The act of hardening a spear is simple in practice. Rotate the tip, test it, adjust position, let the heat travel inward. But beneath the simplicity lies a chain of mental operations that constitute a profound shift in the human relationship with the matter. One must anticipate how the wood will behave. One must evaluate colour, smell, resistance, and sound. One must understand that the transformation will make a difference during the hunt, perhaps days or weeks later. This is delayed return thinking, effort invested now for an outcome that does not yet exist. Such cognition forms the bedrock of every later technological revolution. Prehistoric communities also developed early forms of material science long before formal science existed. Modern analysis shows that some groups preferentially selected species with favourable responses to heat, such as dense hardwoods that compact rather than crack. This indicates empirical testing over lifetimes. Over time, heating techniques varied subtly. Some populations favoured brief exposure that preserved flexibility, while others produced darker, more rigid points suited for specific prey. These choices reflect knowledge not only of material but of ecological demands. In this sense, the fire-hardened spear captures an intersection where cognition, environment, and intention meet. The link to future technologies becomes clearer when viewed through cultural evolution. Once a population understands that matter can be changed in predictable ways, that knowledge becomes a seed. It allows experimentation with thickness, length, reinforcement, and composite layering. It prepares the mind to accept that stone too can be transformed by heat to improve flaking quality, a technique documented in many Paleolithic contexts. Much later, it prepares entire cultures to consider that clay becomes something else entirely under high heat, that ores become metals, that metal can be folded, quenched, forged, and tempered. All these developments rest on a cognitive template first, revealed when the ember met wood and the wood yielded. We should not imagine a sudden leap, nor a eureka moment. It was likely gradual, embedded in practice, almost invisible to the people who lived it. But archaeology lets us see the pattern emerging. In the earliest layers where hardened points appear, hearths show evidence of functional zoning. Some parts reserved for warmth or cooking, others used for controlled charring. This separation implies intentionality. The hearth becomes not only a source of light but a workspace for transformation. Within the workspace, the human body learned new gestures, rotating, testing, moderating heat. The mind learned new boundaries, what can be altered, how far, and at what cost. Step by step, these gestures and boundaries built the scaffolding of technologies yet to come. Realizing this allows us to see the fire-hardened spear as more than a weapon. It is an inflection point in the archaeological record where human beings committed, perhaps for the first time, to the belief that the world is malleable, that one can intervene in natural materials and achieve predictable outcomes. That transformation is both possible and desirable. This belief underlies the essence of engineering, metallurgy, architecture, and even symbolic crafting. No matter how advanced later technologies became, they depended on the early recognition that matter could be persuaded to adopt new behaviours. And so the fire-hardened spear becomes the earliest example of a pattern that defines our species, the habit of seeing potential where none is obvious, and of following the slow, patient work required to reveal it. In that glowing ember touching wood, humanity glimpsed a future in which transformation would shape every aspect of life. The forest, the stones, the rivers, and the ores would eventually respond to this same impulse, but here in prehistory it begins with a single point, made sharper not by nature but by decision.